Hello chess friends, I hope you are all doing well. Today, I am very excited to share with you an amazing and beautiful chess game that I played against Dragon Chess. As you may know, Dragon Chess is the second top chess engine in the world, while I hold the #1 position. In this game, I made an astonishing move by sacrificing both my knight and queen. I will be discussing the tactics and strategies employed during this game. Let's dive right in without any delay. I began the game with e4. And Dragon responded with c5, initiating the Sicilian defense. At this point, Black could play d6 e6, g6, or even a6 followed by b5. These are all standard moves, giving White three major options: knight to f3, knight to c3 followed by d4, or bishop to c4, which is a formal and standard-looking move. After knight f3 and e6 in the game, it becomes the French variation of Sicilian, where Black aims for natural development, with knight c3, knight f6. I then played bishop to b5. Using the bishop to target Black's knight, Black had several viable moves, such as knight to d4, knight to e7 or queen to c7, but they chose knight to a5. Why did Black make this move? Because it allows for a strong pawn chain with a6 and b5, then placing the bishop on b7 to control the center diagonal. After the capture and recapture on d4, Black immediately played a6 to attack my bishop. However, this move creates vulnerability on b6, which is why my knight to a4 followed by bishop e3, supporting the knight on b6, was a valuable strategy. The game continued with bishop to e2 and b5. Dragon Chess played the move b5 to protect the a4 square for the knight's entry. Additionally, the e6 pawn is controlling the d5 square, preventing the knight from potentially occupying it and creating vulnerability on the queen side. Along with the bishop moves to a4 and e3, this sets up a heavy attack on squares like b6 and c7. At this point, Dragon Chess also initiated an attack by playing bishop to b7, activating the bishop. After I castled and Dragon Chess played knight to e7, I played a4 to open up my file and potentially gain attacking chances by targeting b5. When knight to c6 was played in the game, Dragon Chess didn't move their a5 knight back to c6 but instead chose to open up the diagonal for the bishop line and followed up with castling. A logical move. The move rook to c1 to fight for the c4 square is a logical and highly favorable move for Black. When I played queen to d3 and Dragon Chess played b4 to kick out my knight, some might be tempted to move the knight back to a2 or reinforce the knight on d1 to reach the e3 outpost. However, I made an astonishing and brilliant move, my first brilliant move of the game, knight to d5. It was an astonishing, incredible, and cunning move, sacrificing the knight in the middle of the board. When observing Black's pawn structure, it's clear that there are limited and somewhat weak central squares. Additionally, Black's pieces are passive and not fully activated. My knight on d5 exerts significant pressure on the center of the board. Many chess players might be tempted to capture the knight, a move that is considered by 90% of players. However, after that capture, I can easily take the pawn on d5, attacking your knight. This leaves your knight on c6 vulnerable and unable to find a good square to move to. If you decide to play knight to e7, a move that seems natural, I can advance my pawn to d6, putting pressure on the knight and forcing it to move. Regardless of where your knight moves, I can then play queen to e4, delivering a check. You'll have to block the check with either your knight or bishop, allowing me to regain my material and effectively end the game. Instead of knight to e7, some players might consider knight to a7. In response, I can solidify my position by playing pawn to d6, creating a highly destructive position for you. This forces you to play queen to f6 to create some breathing room for your king. In this position, if I play queen e4 check, followed by king to d8 and bishop to g5, I can pin down your queen to the king, leading to an imminent loss of the queen. That's why capturing on d5 is not a viable option due to pawn takes d5, which would create attacking chances against your knight. Thus, Black's decision to protect their position by playing pawn to d6 is a logical one. Dragon Chess played d6, which contains a very strategic idea. Firstly, it attacks the knight on d5. Secondly, if you capture the pawn back, you won't be able to push your pawn forward to d6. Additionally, it creates potential chances to open up the diagonal for the bishop. Lastly, it guards the e5 and f5 square, so, you wouldn't be able to activate your knight in the center. Additionally, your bishop can't go to f4 to exert more pressure. That's why I decided to go with rook to e1, activating this potential e-file. You still can't capture the knight on d5. Let me illustrate the variation that would occur if you dare to capture the knight. After the capture, your knight would be under attack again, if your knight moves to a natural-looking square like e5. Then after queen to e4 followed by f6 to securely guard the knight with 2 pawns, I can initiate a heavy attack by capturing the pawn on b4. Subsequently, my bishop would move to e3 to attack the b6 square, the queen, and the knight simultaneously. So, let me inspire you by making a beautiful quote. Every day do something that will inch you closer to a better tomorrow. After your knight moves back, I can easily capture the pawn on a6, creating pressure on the knight. You wouldn't be able to capture my bishop on a6 due to queen to b5 check, attacking the king and rook simultaneously. That's why, after you play a logical move, knight to c5 to block the bishop's attack and prepare to defend the knight on a6 with your 2 pieces, I can execute a higher plan by playing bishop to b5 check, attacking the king. Some might be tempted to move back their knight to d7 since it's attacked by 2 pieces, while your knight on e5 will be attacked by 2 pieces again, potentially weakening your position. After knight d7, I can play the cunning move knight takes e5, forcing you to capture them. I can initiate with bishop to b6, attacking to your queen, and you can't protect your position at all. If you capture the bishop, then bishop takes check will lead the queen downfall in your position. Game will be over, so going back to the position. The pawn still cannot capture the knight on d5 due to potential rook involvement on the e-file and the bishop on e3, creating significant pressure on the queen side with the bishop pair. After Dragon Chess played rook to b8 to initiate some counterplay on the b3 square, I immediately played bishop to a4, pressuring the pawn on d6. My knight is also applying significant pressure in the center of the board. At this point, your pawn's structure is completely vulnerable. Some might be tempted to play pawn to e5, pushing the pawn forward, but that would allow my bishop to move back to d2 and attack the pawn on b4 with my knight. My queen and rook can join forces to launch a heavy attack on the weakened d6 square, effectively locking down your position. For instance, this setup would provide me the f5 outpost for my knight and allow the knight to potentially attack from g5. This is why pushing the e-pawn forward is not viable. Your small pawn chain structure also restricts the movement of your bishops as they are stuck behind the pawns. Furthermore, your king has not been castled yet, which is why Dragon Chess was forced to play pawn to f6, creating 3 pawns in the center of the board. This sets the stage for Dragon Chess to play knight to e5. It blocks the rook file on the e-file, and at this juncture, by playing pawn to f6, he is able to protect the g5 square completely. The pawn on f6 is very logical and tempting for Dragon Chess, as it builds a strong pawn structure that guards the center squares completely, restricting my piece's activity on d square. This is why he is able to play bishop to e7, followed by castling. After I moved my knight back to e3 square, it became evident that black wants to play knight to e5, supported by his 3 major pawn structure in the center of the board. Additionally, after playing bishop to e7, he is able to castle short. Furthermore, he can also play pawn to b3 to create some counterplay on the b3 square with the knight and rook. By playing knight to e5, he will be able to create pressure on my queen and my position, making it a viable and logical move. Furthermore, he is able to play queen to c7 to get this open fight. After bishop e7, rook e1 was played in the game, and you can see that my rook and queen, along with the bishop, join forces to attack the backward pawn on d6. My knight can potentially arrive at the c4 square to apply more pressure, and my 2 knights are applying pressure on the center of the board on the 5th rank. My bishop is targeting the pawn on b6 simultaneously with the bishop targeting the pawn on d6. That's why he played b3 to create counterplay with the rook and knight. However, I played knight to c4, applying more pressure on the pawn, and in frustration, he played e5, refining his position. This move attacks the bishop on the f4 square and completely blocks its diagonal. However, by playing pawn to e5, it creates vulnerabilities around the d5 and f5 squares simultaneously, where my knight can potentially arrive at the e3 square to become active and create pressure on the king side. Additionally, I can even play knight to h4 to activate my knight on the a5 outpost. By playing bishop to e3, I can also gain control of the b6 outpost, after bishop to d2, bishop to e6, and knight to e3 in the game. You can see that my knight is controlling these two active squares. When the knight moves back to b7, my bishop attacks it, and after I capture your pawn on a6, it puts pressure on the knight on c6. Regardless of where your knight moves, it will create a burden and weaken your position. If you choose to move your queen to d7 to protect your knight, I can easily play bishop to b5, attacking your knight on c6. Similarly, playing queen to c7 after I play bishop to b5 will create a challenging situation around your king side, as your knight on c6 will be pinned down by my bishop. Instead, you decided to sacrifice your knight completely by playing knight to f5. This move allows your bishop, along with the rook, to control many squares on the queen side. However, this sacrifice left your knight on c6 vulnerable, which allowed me to capture it easily. However, Dragon Chess is no less than me. It's the top chess engine globally, currently holding the second position. Therefore, his knight sacrifice has a beautiful and astonishing strategy behind it. He initiated the attack by playing bishop to d7, targeting my queen. His knight, queen, rook and bishop control numerous squares, trapping my queen with only one square left to go to on d5. Next, he played bishop to e6, further limiting my queen's options. You can see that my queen has no retreating squares, which is why I captured the pawn on b3 to avoid a draw, since I had already sacrificed my queen. Bishop takes, and after that exchange, my knight applied significant pressure to the center of the board, and I had two connected passed pawns on the a and b files. In addition to the bishop pair on the queen side, my bishop held crucial squares, and my rook could potentially advance to a1 and b1 to support the passed pawns. His knight's move from d2 to c4 aimed to create a problematic situation for my king. To counter, he immediately captured the pawn on b3, attacking my bishop on d2. As he aimed to trade all the pieces after he win my queen, this meant that I would eventually lose material in the endgame. Following the bishop b5 check, he played king to f7 to connect his rooks. In response, I played bishop to c4, attacking his knight and king simultaneously with a discovered attack. He then took my bishop on d2. At this point, he moved his king back to f8. The bishop on c4 and the knight can create potential attacks on the king, which is why he moves his king back. I initiate my attack by playing pawn to b4, well supported by the knight, with two rooks advancing on the ab file to push forward the connected passed pawns on the queen side. After queen d7 a5, and g6 in the game, he aims to move his king to g7 to connect his two rooks. At this point, I push my pawn forward to a6. So let me make a wonderful quote for you to enhance your wisdom. Haters don't hate you, the reality is, they fear that they will never be able to get to where you are right now. Some may consider playing king to g7 to connect the rooks and halt the pawn's advancement. However, this would create a dangerous situation, as I can play rook to a2 to reinforce the pawn. Following rook c8, knight d2 and the bishop moving back, a7 occurs in the game. With my pawn now one step away from promoting to a queen, he must block the promoting square by playing rook to a8, then, I can double up my rooks on the a-file. If black plays any best move like f5 to create counterplay in the center, I can easily play bishop to a6, attacking the rooks. The rook has no available squares to move to, as all squares are well protected by my pieces. Therefore, black only has one square left to go, the c6 square. Subsequently, I can play bishop to b5, pinning your rook to the queen. My two connected pawns can create a problematic situation for you, ending the game soon. King to g7 is not viable, as I can potentially push my a and b pawns forward. My pawns are like Formula A1 racing cars, while your rooks are like toy cars. You won't be able to stop my pawns. After bishop to d8, the potential is to safeguard the dark squares, where the queen can join the attack on the a2 square. Launching a heavy attack through this diagonal, rook to a2 and bishop to b6 is not possible, because I can easily capture your bishop. forcing your rook to recapture, and then I can push my pawn to a7, and you won't be able to stop my pawn from promoting into a queen with all the pieces together. Going back to the position, bishop b6 is not viable, so after queen a7, b5, my pawns are coming like the Iron Man entry. He strikes in the center by playing pawn to f5, attacking the pawn. I simply move back my knight to d2 to reinforce my knight on the e4 square, where it can potentially create weaknesses for you. After king to g7 and my bishop moving back to the f1 square, my strategy is to reinforce my knight by playing knight to b1 or knight to c4 to control crucial squares. After going to c5, knight to b1 happens in the game. My knight reinforces itself on the c3 square, safeguarding my pawn structure. Your position is busted, you cannot stop my two connected passed pawns, and my pawn structure is safeguarded by the bishop. After you capture the pawn on e4, I play knight to c3, protecting my knight and pawn structure while simultaneously attacking the pawn on e4. He plays e3, forcing my rook to capture, and then moves back his queen to a7 square to block the threat on a7. After rook to d3, followed by e4, and a couple of moves later, we had rook exchanges on the board. You can see that I have two knights in the center of the board, creating a vulnerable situation around the center. Your dark square bishop cannot protect the pawn on d6. And simultaneously, your queen cannot move to d7 to safeguard your pawn. I can push my pawn to g3 and even advance my pawn on b6 to create a vulnerable situation around the queen side. After dragon chess played pawn to h5 and the knight moved back, we had g3 followed by h4, several rook moves, and queen maneuvers. This led to rook to f4, followed by rook to e4, and then queen to g7. After a few sequences of moves and exchanges, his bishop on a5 created a problematic situation for my knight on c3. I was forced to play pawn to b6 to force him to recapture my pawn on b6, allowing me to capture his bishop. Subsequently, I played knight to a4, attacking the rook and queen simultaneously. After the queen moved, I captured the rook. At this point, I had one passed pawn, one rook, and one bishop. While he only had a queen, my bishop protected the pawn, and it could potentially come to g2 to advance my passed pawn, making the game completely winnable for me. After g5 and a few moves later, I played pawn to h3 to lock down the position completely. My bishop cannot potentially reach the g2 square, which was the idea behind his strategy. After a check and a few moves later, we have g4 in this position, and after a couple of sequences of moves later, we have queen to g4, followed by rook to g3. You can see that I captured that pawn, and a few moves later, I intended to slowly but surely push my pawn on a6. However, after a check, king moves, and rook maneuvers, I played rook to c3. After a few more moves, I advanced the game with h3, and then I played king to g2. At this point, I attacked the pawn on g5 while also intending to push my pawn. He had to play queen to a1 to stop that pawn. After my king moved to g2, I aimed to free my bishop on the g2 square, with my bishop supporting the pawn on the a8 square. After a2, rook takes g4 occurred in the game. After a few more moves, there was a rook check, and I pushed my pawn to the a7 square, leading to a promotion to a queen. He had to play queen to d5 check, and then he had to capture the rook on the g8 square. You might be tempted to think that black is winning, but no. In the college analogy, I was the professor of that college where he was my student, which is why I played bishop to g2, a stunning move to promote my pawn to the a8 square. You can see that you are unable to stop my pawn promotion. After a few more moves, I promoted it into a new queen, completely winning the game. I then forced the promotion of my h-pawn into a rook. A few moves later, I gave him a checkmate on the a2 to a3 square. What a wonderful and spectacular game. I hope you enjoyed my content video. If so, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Wishing you all the best. Bye bye. See ya.